And we are doing more, like the UK Office for National Statistics uses 4 questions that I wrote for them that will measure happiness in these ways. And it covers the suite of measures we've been talking about on this call. And people can start using those to make statements about progress or maybe inform some resource allocation decisions. I think there's a couple of obstacles. One is that maybe it's sometimes not seen as the preserve of government. Like it's the government's role to provide roads and houses, schools and healthcare, but it's not its role to intervene into the machinations of the human mind or something, which is silly because ultimately all of those other things are important determinants of the final consequences we talked about, which is how I think how people feel. I think maybe sometimes people think it can't be measured. Hello everyone, I'm Paul Dolan. I'm a Professor of Behavioural Science at London School of Economics, and you're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast.
From PHI Media, I'm Gordon Thane, and this is Designing Happier Lives, Episode 213, Achieving Happiness Through Actions at All Levels of the Socioecological Model. You're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for all things public health and global health, from the Sustainable Development Goals to the social determinants of health, as well as interesting dialogues about the diverse career opportunities that exist in these fields. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify so other people like you can benefit from our content. This is the third and final chapter in this 3-part miniseries with Dr. Paul Dolan. Previously, we talked about what happiness means, its ingredients, why it's challenging to measure it objectively for different cultures, and the influence of social narratives on how we feel about our lives. This time, we conclude by exploring how individual actions, workplace culture, community engagement, and government policies collectively can pave the path forward to enhanced well-being and happiness. But first, Dr. Dolan emphasizes the underrated power of conversations and challenging social norms. By understanding that our personal dilemmas aren't unique, we can foster a deeper connection with others and realize that shared experiences are the bedrock of communal happiness. Now, we touched on a little bit about this, but you talk a little bit about, the cues and defaults and social norms and how these can be harmful for us. In terms of breaking free from that, you mentioned sort of not to put too much onus or blame on ourselves because that's the kind of context in which we live in. How do we kind of have those conversations or as individuals start to think differently to break out of some of those things?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, conversations are important. Like, that's one of the missing areas of research, I think, actually, is understanding the role of conversation in academic research on happiness, which is very much a quantitative science by and large, is to understand the role of conversation, both in happiness itself and also in what you then subsequently do as a result of the conversations that might be different. I mean, one thing is to recognise that we're special, but we're not that special. So chances are, if I kind of start talking about, like you said about so many people who say about their horrible jobs that they love, is to kind of like realise that you're probably not alone.
Right.
I think sometimes we do feel, so many times we feel so special and like I'm the only person that's feeling this. It's like chances are if you said this out loud, you'd get quite a few more people nod than you might otherwise think. So I think maybe that's an interesting thing that we could think about designing into our lives, is a sort of a realisation of our lack of uniqueness.
One memorable part of our conversation with Dr. Dolan is how terribly wrong we get things by living by the mantra, you shouldn't sweat the small stuff. What does this mean in the context of a workspace, where you aren't necessarily going for fun, but rather out of the need to provide for yourself and your family? The pathway to happiness in workplaces is through being appreciated and feeling a sense of purpose. That's where the small stuff can go a long way.
And I wanted to dig into the specifics of how we can design happier lives. And a big focus for a lot of people is that workplace. So I know you were laughing at the fact that people say, don't sweat the small stuff. But in fact, it is actually important. And I know when you're in your writings, you talk about evaluative versus experience perspectives when talking about this. So from that specific perspective of work, what are some of those small things you should be looking into, and what should you focus on?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. So I think this is where first of all, it's worth saying that distinction between pleasure and purpose is important, because most people don't go to work for fun, right? I mean, there's lots of things you can do that would be more fun than work, right? But you go to work because you feel like it has a point, or you'd like to go to work because it feels like it has a point. You'd like to go to work because it feels like it's meaningful. And actually, there's nothing more painful than feeling like you're wasting time. Even if you're being paid a fortune, right? It's, in the end, you're probably going to quit because it's just too painful just to feel like you're not making a contribution in some small way to something beyond the paycheck. So how can you foster that in workplaces? Well, a very simple thing you can do as managers is to give feedback to people more readily, more organically, more authentically, with a thank you, or a, or when something is going to feel like a waste of time. So I've been working a long time on a project and the contract has changed or whatever the work, and it just goes like, how many managers just won't say anything? Oh, that's a shame. That's like, say no, actually, really thank you for your efforts, but we will try and use some of this work elsewhere or later. And that. What we know from behavioural science is that you have big effects from small interventions. These are not big. I'm not suggesting any big cultural wide, mission statement change, banners across the workplace, sirens sounding, everyone all hugging. Like, that's not, it's in the little stuff that we do, how we interact with each other. It's in the small stuff, the appreciation, and in that timely and salient feedback. I think that's actually one of the most important things you can do. And, thinking about ways in which you can find purpose in the small stuff. I think that is it, both as individual employees, also as managers. One of the things we mentioned Danny Kahneman earlier. One of the things that came out, one of his early studies using the day reconstruction method, where you ask people how happy they are during the activities of their workday. This was a study of Texan women, is that they're least happy when they're with their boss. Now, I mean, it's not a great advert for bosses, is it?
No, not really.
Those interactions I'm sure could be made more purposeful by the recognition that all of us want to feel like we're doing something that has a point to it.
And based on that source, I'm thinking about it now, and it's probably going to be small things that add up to bigger things over time, right? Why people feel least happy with their boss. It's probably a series of small interactions that led to that feeling.
It will be. And also the other thing is, I suppose, that you could say if the bosses can't make people happy, is just keep out the workers' ways. I guess let them get on with their job. I mean, we do have a tendency sometimes to over-engineer things, like lots of meetings, lots of discussions, or whatever. Could probably do away with quite a lot of those in the workplace. But there are little things that you can do in your own, actually maybe even in the physical environment, right? I said about going outdoors. That's a universal truth that biophilia is good for us, right? Being around nature. I mean, I come from a city and I don't really like going into the countryside, but still, I will be physiologically and psychologically better off when I'm around nature, when I'm around plants, so even some fake plants, if you work in an office where you can't have nature, even like these little things will be, can be quite significant.
In public health, we often talk about the socioecological model, which was developed to improve the understanding of the dynamic interrelations among various personal and external factors. It is often depicted as 4 or 5 circles of various sizes encapsulating each other. From inside to out, you have the individual or interpersonal level factors at the center. Then you have intrapersonal or relationship level factors. Then workplace or organizational level factors. And then you have community level factors. And then on the very outside, you have societal factors. The idea here is that you can exert the greatest public health influence through the biggest, largest circle at the societal level. Well, how exactly do we do just that? Oftentimes, it's through policy implemented through advocacy efforts or governmental action. When we think of interventions, oftentimes it's a massive program that benefits many people. But in this case, Dr. Dolan argues that it can look a bit differently, starting with measuring happiness in the first place and making this knowledge more accessible to individuals and their communities. He questions why happiness measures aren't more integral to policymaking and societal priorities. I'm glad that we're kind of working our way through it. We talked about some of the things that individuals can do to design happier lives within the workplace itself as an employee, what you can do, what bosses and managers can do. When we keep working our way up the chain to in terms of sphere of influences, and we get up to sort of the government societal level, what's the government's role in all of this and making people happy? You talked about engineering, having more time is important. Is that something governments can do? Are there other things they can do to create the conditions where people can explore what makes them happy?
Well, measuring stuff is important, right? Even if they're not doing anything by way of nudges or shoves or interventions, actually just making information available would be important, right? So, when my kids go off to university, if they go, or they go get jobs at whatever point, right, they'll know lots of things about the jobs they might go into. They'll know how much they're going to earn. Why don't they find out how happy people are in that job? Why don't they get that information given to them? Like, they may decide to ignore it, right? I'm not going to be paternalistic and say, pick jobs that make you happy. There's be all sorts of confounding factors. We all know that. There's going to be correlations and not causal mechanisms and all these things and stuff. But just even that, just like a little bit of insight would seem to be relevant information about a job. So there's lots of little things, again, that can be done. And a lot of those will emanate from measurement. I mean, just taking the measures seriously.
Happiness, as Dr. Dolan points out, is deeply personal, yet its pursuit is universal. The narrative shifts to happiness's subjective nature and the challenges in its measurement. Despite these hurdles, recognition and appreciation of this subjectivity can guide more informed decisions at both the individual and policy levels.
Remember, we started almost right at the beginning, which you sort of alluded to the sort of subjectivity of happiness, and it's different to different people. That's life, isn't it? I mean, my life is lived as a subjective experience. I've got tattoos, right? People will ask me how much they hurt. I'll say, well, I can just point to places where generally that hurts more there than here. But I don't know how much it's going to hurt for you.
Right.
Your level of pain, Fredo, has been completely different to mine. Some people do scream in pain every moment the needle goes in. Other people, can fall asleep. I mean, that there is something objective in the tattooing, but the experience of that objectivity is subjective. And I think a proper appreciation and recognition of the subjectivity is absolutely fundamental. And then we can start drawing out inferences about these groups that are experiencing life in a very different way to how we might measure it objectively or how we might predict or imagine.
You make a good case for the importance of measurements. So why is it not more widely adopted then? What's a limiting factor?
Well, that is such a good question. I think that's a good question. And we are doing more. Like the UK Office for National Statistics uses 4 questions that I wrote for them that will, measure happiness in these ways. And it covers the suite of measures that we've been talking about on this call, and people can start using those to make statements about progress or maybe inform some resource allocation decisions. I think there's a couple of obstacles. One is that maybe it's sometimes not seen as the preserve of government. Like, it's the government's role to provide roads and houses, schools and healthcare, but it's not its role to intervene into the machinations of the human mind or something, which is silly because ultimately all of those other things are important determinants of the final consequences we talked about, which is how I think how people feel. I think maybe sometimes people think it can't be measured, and it can't be measured perfectly for all the reasons that we talked about before, but some measurement is better than none, I think. So I think there's a number of reasons. I actually feel increasingly frustrated at myself or the happiness academics of not galvanising public interest more, right? I mean, you can get people who care about the environment to glue their hands to the pavement.
Right.
The rights or wrong of that is neither here nor there for this conversation. They will do that because they're motivated to do so. We can't get people to knock down the doors of Parliament or government buildings to say, I need someone to talk to people about stuff, or we need to create a world where other people have someone to talk to about stuff, right? That's a fundamental. It's like, that's very, very basic. So I feel like, what are we missing? It's a good question. I've been asking myself that question a little more recently, to go back to one of my earlier points about trying to get the ivory tower into the street. I want to be like, how is it that I can't persuade people to do things that are obviously good for us as a society, to galvanise us to care more about social relationships or whatever it is? So I feel like we're missing something. So I don't have a good answer to your question, I think, is my answer to your question. Because if I did have a good answer to it, we'd get measures of well-being more directly into policy.
At the decision-making level, there seems to be a lack of appreciation for the connection between human behavior, motivation, incentives, and happiness. Dr. Dolan emphasizes the importance of incentives and government frameworks for preserving liberties and informing individuals about their choices. Would you say something is, and I'll try to, hopefully you'll understand where I'm coming from here. Would you say that there's something missing in terms of, because I read the book Freakonomics a few years ago, and I was astonished kind of how a lot of things like behavioral sciences, people's motivation links to like incentives with financial or other types of incentives.
Right.
Is there sort of a lack of appreciation on the connection between those things? Like, there is a business case for happiness, essentially, and it's commercialized every day. But in terms of as an end goal for happiness and health, it's just not quite seen the same way.
No, I think that's a good observation. I think, if people respond to incentives, then you're much more like, if you're seeking elected office, for example, you're much better off trying to give people what they want or what they think would be good for them than you would be giving them things that would actually show up as being good for them when those two things come apart.
Right.
And so that's certainly a market failure almost in the political system. Because I've never. This is really, really important, because sometimes this happiness stuff can sound quite paternalistic, and there are some clear paternalists who work in this area. I'm actually very libertarian, actually. When something is so categorically shown as being good for us, then libertarians should be crying out for this to be something that governments take seriously. If we're not able to do these things ourselves, like some of the social connectedness, maybe swim against the tide of expectations to keep taking more and more high-paying jobs, we need frameworks in government to ensure that our liberties are being, kind of preserved, but that we're being informed, in the very least, about the impact of the kinds of choices that we're making, either individually or societally. So there is, I don't know, it still comes back to that kind of frustration that I feel about not doing more to galvanise a sort of movement, a social movement, I suppose, that would be banging down the doors of government to get happiness taken more seriously.
Is it time to rethink traditional GDP measures to now consider gross national happiness and move beyond economic indicators to reflect what truly matters for well-being? Well, GDP is seen as a useful measure for economic growth and progress in poverty reduction, but perhaps not complex enough by itself to capture human happiness. Dr. Paul Dolan posits that happiness-focused measures could redefine success on both national and global scales.
One of the things that I was curious about, and as you were talking about, the policy level and government structures and how we can take happiness more seriously at those levels, is I can't remember how long ago, but I heard that some countries are starting to think about their GDP measurements differently and thinking about more like gross national happiness measures.
Yeah.
And I think Bhutan has pioneered a lot of work in that space that considers a couple of other metrics. To Gordon's point, there's a lot of focus on economics, finances, and rightly so in many cases, but expanding that definition to have this more collective measurement of happiness and well-being. What are your thoughts on that? Is that kind of the end goal where you can make those create those larger data sets? And, when we're thinking about us as humanity at a more broader level, going beyond finances, is that where we're trying to go to with all this?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? I mean, you think of GDP, it wasn't the metrics that were used to, measure output initially were never intended to be used for national, like indicators of national prosperity. They've kind of like ballooned or mushroomed out into being used by that. And so maybe if we could get these happiness measures moved, rather than going straight to the GDP level, get them used more in these local, smaller ways, then they might end up becoming much more global and national. But, you're right, what you said, because you kind of caveated it yourself, is that economic growth is very good when you're poor. Getting people out of poverty, for the reasons that we spoke about earlier, is fundamentally important. So again, I don't like this sort of degrowth arguments that people often say, because if you're living in poor parts of poor nations, then economic growth is the single best thing that you need in order to be happy. It's in the luxury positions that many countries and people within countries are in, where we might be thinking more about a move to metrics that would take us outside of the economic indicators and more accurately reflect the things that really matter, things that I've spent 30 years or more trying to contribute towards, which is the richness of the human experience. That is fundamental. Because if you ask people, it's a simplistic way of seeing it, but if you ask people why they want anything, ultimately it's to feel good. I think whilst we make all sorts of mistakes, about what make us happy, and a lot of the behavioural science work is sort of laughing at how stupid we all are by all these biases and heuristics, the ones that Kahneman and Tversky named and others besides. But we're not that stupid. Like, if you put your hand over a flame, unless you have a pathology to like pain, you're not going to keep doing it. So we make lots of mistakes, but we're fundamentally motivated for survival and to be happy.
Right.
And the incentives, you talked about incentives just now, the incentives for survival are much greater when we feel good than when we feel bad. So I think there is a fundamental first order concern for feeling good.
Throughout the last 3 episodes, including this one, we've been talking about pleasure, purpose, and social narratives, and how those fit in with designing happier lives. So it was only right to ask Dr. Dolan about his life beyond academia. From podcasts to writing, he shares how prioritizing what matters can lead to a fulfilling life, especially when you're connecting with others. In his response, he points to the importance of implementation intention. Now, when you're not busy being a professor, hosting all these podcasts and TV shows.
Spending my Sunday afternoon on a podcast with you.
There we go. You said it, not me.
Your listeners should know this, shouldn't they? Sunday afternoon, Sunday morning for you guys.
Sunday evening with us on the podcast. I know you have 2 podcasts, Get Happier and Duck Rabbit. You have a Substack page, I think called Crystal. You've published.
Yeah.
How do you find all these? Speaking of time and making time for things that make you happy, how do you find time to do all this stuff? And can you tell people a little bit more about how to find your books and your podcast, your Substack page, what they can look forward to by reading or consuming that content?
So, in answer to your first question, having a lot of energy helps. And again, you can't. They're not things that you can kind of engineer. We see it across people, don't we? You see lots of variation. But one thing that all of us can do, irrespective of our energy, is to have better ways of implementing our intentions. That's the term. It's implementation intentions. We all have intentions. We've all got intentions to do all sorts of things. Most of those are cheap talk and never follow through into action because we don't plan how to make them actionable, right? So we mentioned the gym earlier. I've gone to the gym 5 times a week for 30 years, right? Pretty much without fail. Why? Because I plan it. Like, all right, admittedly, I don't like that. My session times now are shorter than they once were, but I do 30 to 45 minutes on those sessions. They're built in my diary. Like, I don't wake up in the morning and say, I'll go to the gym sometime today, and then by night time I haven't been. And then the same thing happens the next day and the next day. Yeah. Like, it's because it's important to me. And when, and I appreciate, again, the working class, kind of experiences in me know that some people have very supremely busy lives earning very little money. and won't be able to find time to go to the gym for 30 minutes every day. But I'm not talking to those people, not on this piece. In this piece, it's when people say they haven't got time, it's because they're not making time. And it's not a priority. You know, like, and we all know people when people say, like, you ask them to go out for a beer and they say, oh, I haven't got any money, and they've just booked a, like, you know, holiday or something, right? It's not like they haven't got any money. It's just that they've chosen to prioritise it in a particular way, right. And that very much comes down to time. And you know, so I have to plan all these things in a busy day, in a busy life. That's you can't just wing it. So planning what's important, finding your priorities, establishing what it is that you really want to do. Not the ones you tell the story about, right? Everyone say, I want to write a book. Well, you're probably not going to. You don't really want to. But insofar as you do, and it would make you happier, plan writing time. You know, put time aside to write. So that is the fundamental. It's an obvious thing to say, but it is overlooked. You don't want to over-engineer the planning. It's, you know, it doesn't leave room for spontaneity and all those things that actually make life worth living. But you do need a little bit of planning in how you're going to, you know, use your time. And I'm a hopeless self-promoter, so I have no idea. You've mentioned all the things that I would like you to mention, which is the podcast, Duck Rabbit podcast, which is the polarization ones. The shorter Get Happier, if you just want little tips, they're like lots of 10 minutes, those ones on how you can get happier, using the 10 letters of Get Happier. They're more on the theme of this conversation. And my Substack, I'm trying to put all of my non-academic papers in one place by writing blogs and doing audio notes. I do 60-second voice notes. I've really quite got into doing those. That comes from whenever I used to leave messages to people on voice note, I would always make them they would always be a minute. That's about as long as you need to make a point. So I'm doing 60 seconds on various things. And Crystal, you're absolutely right. That's the name of the Substack. Interestingly, I had in mind Crystal Clear or Crystal Ball. Mm-hmm. A lot of people have thought crystal meth. Well, that's probably, you know, that clearly says much more about them than me. Crystal Clear. Hopefully what I say there is nice and clear for people to access.
Fair enough. And your 2 books, and it sounds like there's another one coming in the works as well?
2 books, Happiness by Design and Happy Ever After. The Narrative Trap is a good title for Happy Ever After, by the way. I like, because it's about those kinds of stories that get in the way. Happiness by Design is much more about, you know, what you can do for yourself to be happier day to day. The Narrative Trap is being alert to some of those stories that might get in the way of you being happy. And then working title for, yes, you're absolutely right, for the 3rd book is Taking Sides. I'm so interested in many things about that, and we can have a whole other session on that at some point. But I'm really interested in how some people have very, very strong beliefs about things they can't possibly know anything about. And
Right.
I find that really interesting.
Yeah.
Like I feel so strongly about this, but like what do you actually know? Like, but do you actually know? Like, what do you know about this?
Right.
Nothing.
and it seems like there's a reluctance to even want to know more about this. They just kind of live in that space.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Exactly. Much
we might
better
have to talk more about that. That's one of my pet peeves.
To have
too.
this, is it? Yeah, like this real passionate ignorance.
Yeah.
It's like what? Like, how is it that we've got into this position where you can, you're strongly signalling just this is so important to you, but you don't even know what you're talking about.
I'm gonna take a read of that book. I think it'll resonate with me.
Thank you.
This show was edited by me, Gordon Thane, with additional editing from LaShawn Benedict. Sound design and mixing by myself and LaShawn Benedict. The original music from The Music Room, composed by Tom Fox, licensed from Johnny Harris. The cover art designed for our show by LaShawn Benedict. The Public Health Insight Podcast is produced by PHI Media. Thank you for listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for informative conversations, inspiring community action. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. See you in the next one.